Thanks, Stephanie. Let me see if I can.
Let me see. Are you able to share?
I think I can. Just let's see.
Okay, yeah. Yes, and Zainab, thank you. We are recording, so that's just a reminder.
Can everyone see this?
Yes.
Great. So this is a small group today, which is lovely. So please don't hesitate to ask questions. I have a not a super long presentation prepared. And so I wanted to, I spoke a little bit last time I was here in the spring about some of my work in Mexico. And so today I wanted to talk about a recent paper that I just worked on that was looking at tree planting across the tropics and asking sort of what is going on, what are people doing with tropical restoration, reforestation. And so this paper just came out in Biological Conservation and was the product of postdoctoral work with colleagues at Yale and at the Nature Conservancy. So just to give a little bit of background, hopefully familiar for all of you ISTF tropical folks, but tropical forests are estimated to contain about half of the world's above ground carbon. They sequester up to 15% of global carbon dioxide emissions, and they house nearly 2/3 of the world's biodiversity. So hugely important ecosystems, of course, but are being lost at a rapid rate. Less than 50% of the world's tropical forests remain, and those that do are being continually deforested or degraded at rapid rates. And so as this deforestation and degradation has progressed, the conversation has sort of shifted from purely thinking about conserving the remaining tropical forests to thinking about restoring those that have already been lost. And so there's been a real boom in work thinking about tropical reforestation from ecological perspective, and it really sort of started to take off with some big modeling papers that came out. So this was this paper by the Crowther Lab, Baston et al., that got a lot of press when it came out, and they basically mapped out all the areas in the world that they thought would be suitable for reforestation and restoration, and calculated that if we got, and I think it was 1.3 trillion trees, that we could absorb an enormous amount of carbon and really have a huge dent in climate change. And so this paper got a ton of press. Planting trees is really a popular concept, and everyone really sort of got on board with this idea, and it was a very easy concept for people to understand. And so I think if you ask Crowther and his lab, they were not saying that we should necessarily plant these trillion trees, that they could come about through a variety of ways. But this idea of planting a trillion trees to solve climate change just sort of took off in the popular press. So these are articles from The Guardian, from all sorts of other places. And so a lot of excitement came out of this concept that if we just plant lots of trees, and particularly in the tropics where we've had all this deforestation, that we can just sort of solve climate change that way. And of course, there was a lot of pushback to that concept, just within the media, and also from ecologists saying, tree planting is not so simple as just putting trees here and there. And also this idea that if we plant trees, we can solve climate change is going to potentially take away from all the other things that we need to do in terms of reducing our own emissions and taking all these other steps. So there definitely was a lot of backlash. There were also a lot of comments on the article itself, questioning the methods, saying that the modeling, ignored albedo effects and had, incorrect methods, that they were including grasslands and afforestation things that might have negative consequences. So there was a lot of backlash to this paper, but at that point, the message had already spread. And so all of these campaigns erupted, were created with the idea of planting a trillion trees. And again, this was a really, the idea of planting trees has a lot of sort of bipartisan support. So even Donald Trump signed an executive order establishing the 1 trillion trees interagency council to coordinate the federal government support of the global 1 trillion trees initiative. And it just became this really easy to grab onto, really feel good idea that we'll solve all our environmental problems by planting trees. And so we started thinking about, well, if all of these organizations are starting to plant trees, potentially at a really rapid rate, we wanted to have a sense of what's actually going on, who is doing all this tree planting, where are they planting all of these trees, how many are they planting, what species, what kind of trees are they planting, what methods are they using, what objectives are they aiming to reach by planting trees. And so this project really came out of this idea of saying, like, wow, everybody's really excited about planting trees, and it's definitely happening all over the place, but there's very little understanding on a more global level of what's actually going on and what people are actually doing. So we had the idea to just compile our own database and try to get a sense of what was going on in the nonprofit and the for-profit world. So ignoring government efforts, but looking at all these organizations that are cropping up. And so we used a number of Google searches looking for terms like tropical reforestation, restoration, afforestation, and a number of different sort of term combinations. We also searched for organizations in these charity databases, Global Giving and Charity Navigator. And we looked at this database treenation.org, which is sort of a repository for different tree planting projects around the world. And we decided to focus our efforts on organizations that are working in tropical and subtropical climates, because we think that the challenges and issues around tropical reforestation and restoration are somewhat different than in some temperate areas and in urban areas. So we excluded those organizations. And so we came up with 174 organizations that matched our criteria. They were a combination of nonprofit organizations as well as for-profit companies. And so we looked at the publicly available information for each of these, at their websites, at their annual reports, things like this, and we recorded we recorded a bunch of information. So type of organization, where their headquarters were located, where they were doing these tree planting projects, where their project locations were, their mission statements. Many organizations reported sort of running tallies of the number of trees planted. And so we would record that or compile it from annual reports where possible. If they recorded the area that they had restored, we included that. If they mentioned restoration methods, we recorded that. And if they mentioned particular species, we recorded those either as common names or as species names. And so there was a lot of information in here, and I'm just going to highlight a few different things in today's talk. And I'd love to have more of a conversation about this over our cookies, which may or may not be here already. So I'm not going to belabor the presentation too long, but we found a few really sort of neat patterns. And so one was simply that there had in fact been a real dramatic increase in the number of organizations dedicated to planting trees in the last few decades. And this makes a lot of sense, right? There's been this increased interest in reforestation and restoration. And so it makes sense that these organizations have sprung up to respond to that interest. We also found, again, not surprisingly, with the case of many conservation and development organizations, that the headquarters for many of these organizations in B here were really located in the global north, Europe and the United States, whereas of course the projects themselves were located, the ones that we were looking at, in places with tropical and subtropical forest areas. And we found that, in total, based on all the sort of tallies and information we found, that organizations reported planting 1.4 billion trees since 1961, which, sounds like a lot, but when we looked at sort of what the estimated mean annual rate was for just the past 5 years, we found that, at the rate that organizations are planting, it would still take over 1,000 years to plant 1 trillion trees. So there's that. We also were really interested in what methods people were using, so how people were planting trees. And we found that by far the most common methods that were reported were really had to do with planting things in a sort of useful way. So agroforestry was used by basically half of organizations. Different plantations, silvopasture were really common. Whereas these sort of more sort of natural methods that are highlighted in green, natural regeneration, assisted natural regeneration, were really reported to be used much more infrequently by organizations. But perhaps the biggest thing here we found was that many organizations don't specify the type of restoration method they're using at all. They just say that they're planting trees. And so that was a really notable takeaway, is just sort of the lack of detail that organizations are providing in their public facing information was quite striking across a number of different informational categories. And I think there's a number of reasons of why this might be that we can get into a little bit later. And so, unsurprisingly, we found that the most commonly reported species also really aligned with this heavy reliance on agroforestry systems and on plantations. So this is a list of the most frequently reported species. So we don't actually have information on how many trees of each of these species are being planted, but this is the frequency at which organizations are using these in different projects. And so you can see that the top species here are all these sort of commercial utilitarian species. We have cacao for chocolate, we have teak, moringa, which is kind of this new superfood that everybody's excited about, mango, coffee, mahogany, avocado, and so on. We did see that overall organizations mentioned almost 700 unique species, which is a fair number. But again, if we consider that there's 40 to 50,000 tree species that grow in the tropics, 700 is really a small drop in the bucket in terms of the diversity that's available. We also, and again, speaking to sort of the lack of detail, found that almost a quarter of the organizations that we examined only mentioned a single species on their website. And half of those that we looked at reported fewer than 5. And so, it's difficult to say, of course, whether these organizations are simply planting very few species, or whether this is kind of an artifact of the information that they think donors are interested in. And so I think that definitely an issue that has come up here is this lack of detail in the information that is being communicated between the organizations and between the donor community, and how much of that is based on sort of what donors care about, and how much is based on what the organizations are doing, or sort of a broader issues of lack of transparency is of course a little bit difficult to discern. And so we also saw that, a lot of these organizations really seem to be trying to achieve multiple objectives with their planting projects. And so a lot of the most commonly used words had to do with people, with economic development. We also had conservation, biodiversity, things like that. And you can see, here are some examples from a few different organizations, right? Plant trees, save lives. That's a very bold statement. We have, tree planting relating to wildlife habitat, saving orangutans. We plant the world's most powerful carbon capturing forests. And so, of course, tropical reforestation can achieve multiple benefits. You absolutely can have carbon sequestration and economic development and wildlife habitat go hand in hand. But there are, of course, going to be a lot of trade-offs depending on the restoration methods that are used and on the species that are used. So, planting a lot of cacao and coffee might be great for sustainable economic development, but those are really small statured trees and shrubs, and so the amount of carbon that they are going to sequester is just inherently going to be limited compared to tree species that are faster growing and grow to be just bigger in terms of their biomass. And there's a lot of range in terms of how agroforestry can look on the landscape. So these are two photos of coffee agroforestry systems. On the right, we have a shade-grown coffee system that's much more of a kind of rustic system, where a lot of the original overstory diverse canopy exists, and the coffee is grown in the understory. And then we have this open grown coffee plantation here. And so it's sort of all very well to say we are using these agroforestry systems in order to sequester carbon and also bring economic development and also provide wildlife habitat. But of course, the amount of wildlife habitat you're going to be having, the amount of carbon you're going to be sequestering is completely different depending on which of these systems you use. And there's a lot of evidence showing that the way these systems develop over time, depending on boom and bust cycles of these supply chains, can really shift. And so there can be pressure to have increased intensification as prices for coffee shift or prices for cacao shift. And so this was another issue that we noted in our study, is that there was a lot of discussion about, we're planting these agroforestry systems, we're planting these species that are going to help local communities. And I think it's fantastic that restoration is taking local people into account. But there was very little focus from what we saw on creating supply chains and creating the infrastructure to actually bring that economic development in those markets to the restored or planted areas. And many of you who have experience with these things will know that just planting a product is not the same, is not going to guarantee an economic benefit if there's no consistent market and there's no consistent place to sell this. And I know from my own experience, from my own work in Peru, the farmers there, at the time, the government was really promoting camu camu, which was this berry, and they were bringing truckfuls of seedlings for farmers to plant. And they were all kind of rolling their eyes because 5 years ago it had been noni that they had brought, and 5 years before that it had been star anise or something else. And these trees take a long time to grow and mature and for these products to arrive, and if there's no follow-up and no supply chain in place, you can't just magically sell these things and have an economic benefit. The other thing that I wanted to highlight is, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with planting these commercial species. I think, there are a lot of benefits to planting things that people are interested in having, and planting things that can provide economic benefits and all of these different things. But I do think that when we're looking at this on a global scale, to see that these very same suite of species and a relatively small suite of species are really being planted all over the globe, well outside of their native ranges, is a little bit concerning. And so I think that there is a little bit of a danger when these projects and these organizations aren't talking to each other and aren't aware of what's happening, that each one thinks, well, we're planting cacao and coffee, but then when you scale out and go, wow, everybody's planting cacao and coffee all across the tropics, that there's a bit of a danger of creating this sort of pan-tropical, sort of homogenized suite of species that is found throughout these kind of restored, reforested, replanted areas. And so I think being able to step back and sort of think about balancing diversity both on a local and on a more global scale is something that might need to be considered more with these restoration efforts. And to be fair to the organizations, I think that in many cases, coffee and cacao and mango and all of these things, teak, these seedlings are widely available. We know very well the methods that are required to germinate and grow these things, whereas for native species, that knowledge is not necessarily as widely known or as readily available, and the nurseries and the seed sources and all these things are not necessarily in place as infrastructure. So I think that that's another real opportunity for future work to focus on building up easy access to more native and localized suites of species, and to build up databases or just knowledge about how to grow and regenerate and recruit these other species. Then the other thing, which is also concerning, and I don't mean to be so negative about this study, was the real lack of reported monitoring, right? So it's one thing to plant 1.4 billion trees. It's a totally different story to have 1.4 billion trees actually survive and live and grow. And so regardless of what your objectives are with tree planting, whether it's getting some economic benefit, whether it's getting carbon sequestration, whether it's providing habitat for wildlife, growing a timber or something like that, you're only getting that benefit if your tree actually survives and grows and gets big enough and old enough to provide that benefit. And we found that only 18% of the studies, of the organizations that we looked at, even mentioned monitoring their plantings at all. And of all of them, only 5% actually mentioned measuring survival rates. And I put a photo of some mangroves here just because there have been case studies, particularly for mangroves, but with a huge range of different plantings, showing that in many cases, when we actually go back and look and monitor and see what's surviving, there are really atrocious survival rates. So a study in Sri Lanka found a less than 10% survival rate for mangrove seeds planted. We found that mangroves were a pretty commonly reported group. 13 organizations across 26 different projects reported using them. And so, if these organizations aren't monitoring and aren't measuring survival, it's a real misrepresentation of the impacts that they're having. But B, it's a real missed opportunity to learn and get better at doing these things, and spend time figuring out what methods are working and what's not. And this is another case. I've spoken with some people at Conservation International, and they say that it's a real struggle to get donors to fund monitoring in their projects, that a lot of donors are just really not interested in that. And so I think that this is another case where this need for more communication between the donor community, between the scientific community, and between the organizations doing this work is really, really important. And so figuring out how to shift a conversation towards maybe less of a reporting of how many trees have planted, but shifting towards how many trees have survived, or even better, area restored that maybe includes natural regeneration and other things, and or a step further, reporting what are the actual outcomes. Are people getting the economic benefits that we are hoping for? How much carbon is being sequestered in these systems? That there needs to be a better conversation and better focus on what are the actual outcomes that we're looking for, and not just sort of a feel good, like I paid $10 and I offset my my recent Delta flight or something like that. And so, I think the main takeaways here really are this lack of transparency on the organization's part, and that real need for communication between organizations and researchers and donors. And I think that part of that communication also needs to be around the sort of science of restoration, that research and science focused on restoration that has found lots of other ways of restoring forests besides simply planting trees. And there absolutely are instances where planting trees might be necessary or might be preferable. Again, if you're looking for some of these commercial species, that might be a great way to go. But to have a lot more inclusion into the conversation of natural regeneration, of things like applied nucleation, of assisted natural regeneration, and the sort of economic benefits of using those, the ecological benefits of using those, and what those even mean. I think it's the image of planting trees is one that is appealing to everyone, right? From Donald Trump to the most progressive of folks. And so I understand very much the allure of that, that it's, great to be able to tell donors we planted 1 million trees. But I think the more we can shift our focus to the actual outcomes in terms of how are these forests being restored, the more successful that will be. So that's all I have for my PowerPoint presentation. And I'm happy to either have some conversations here or I'll shift outside where we can see our lovely faces. If everybody is on campus, I also don't know if that's the case. So
I don't know. I guess everybody's on campus right now. I'm not sure. I have a question. Maybe we'll just wrap up, like there's stuff. Maybe we'll just do like Q&A real fast. And then like any other kind of discussion we can mingle outside. I actually had a couple of questions though.
yeah.
So we'll start with that. So, and I might have missed this when you were talking about in the beginning. Is there some sort of grant program for this trillion tree project that's giving money to these organizations?
So the Trillion Tree Initiative has there are a few different sort of iterations, and they are often kind of partnerships out of a bunch of different organizations. So the Nature Conservancy has the 1T, is connected to the 1T.org. And then a lot of other organizations have kind of made pledges to contributing to planting 1 billion trees, contributing to planting 1 trillion trees. And so there's sort of a conglomeration of a lot of different NGOs that are pulling together for these things. I think, a really interesting follow-up study actually would be to look at the kind of interconnecting relationships between these organizations, because there was a lot of, we tried our best not to double count things, but there are a lot of organizations that sort of subcontract
Right.
their actual, the tree planting to other organizations, and the transparency around that is also really lacking. But had we had more time to be able to kind of pick that apart and do, I don't even know, network analysis or something like that, looking at.
I was just about to say like social network analysis, there's some people in like PRTM that do that.
Yeah, I think it would be really interesting. And also, looking at the economics of how much money is funneled into this and how much it actually costs, I think would also be fascinating. But
yeah, and I think something like that would help with the monitoring and like evaluation, right? If they were like, had to stay accountable for following up. So that's why I was asking if there was some sort of like overarching organization, I guess the Nature Conservancy, but no one, offering funding for these communities to do it. I think I could see that like being kind of like a next step to this initiative. But
yeah, and I think we looked at 174 organizations, and there was a huge range in size and type there, and a huge range in detail. So there's one, I'm blanking on the name, but it was a super local organization in India that gave an enormous amount of detail in their annual reports, down to the numbers of apple trees and this tree and that tree that they, tamarind and everything that they had planted every time, and the money that they had spent on all of it. They were super transparent. And then, on the other hand, you have some for-profit organizations. So there's this rise of these beta corporations, which are social enterprise. I don't fully know those sort of legal details around them, but they're for-profit companies that have like pledged to also have sort of social and environmental goals as part of their mission. And so there are a number of these that are doing sort of carbon projects, right, where sort of trying to get into the carbon credit market, I think. And the level of transparency there is often really different when it's a private company also.
any other questions?
I have a question. Do you know, are any of these organizations working through, or they're working to help meet the goals of REDD+? Because I'm wondering if maybe that's part of the reason why so many of these species are coalescing around key financially viable ones, because it's like, look, you know, we're either keeping forests or we're reforesting. And yeah, it might be helping us in the long run, but we're also getting the money from, you know, the REDD organization.
So I would say that's not something that we recorded, but from my memory, there were not many that specifically mentioned REDD by any means. I think that the focus on commercial species has to do with a few things, and I don't think they're all by any means. I don't think they're entirely bad. So, you know, I think that there's a long history in conservation and ecology of just completely ignoring any local human people as being, if not immaterial, then actually being, you know, bad and harmful, and really blaming people for deforestation and loss of biodiversity and all these things. And so I think on the good side, it does seem like there's been a real shift in at least the way that organizations are talking about people as being you know, partners in this work. And I think that the emphasis on commercial species is sort of one way in which they're doing that. I didn't necessarily see a lot of description of engaging people as kind of true stakeholders in terms of having them necessarily be part of the planning process and decision-making process. But, you know, again, how much of that is they just don't talk about that in their annual reports or in their websites, and how much is they're not doing it. I suspect a fair amount of it is that they're not doing it, but, you know, I can't say for sure. But then, you know, I think the other thing is a lot of this information is designed for lay people, and people know what coffee and mango and teak and mahogany are, and they're not necessarily going to recognize some, you know, obscure dipterocarp species. And so it is a little bit difficult to say, you know, how many people are in fact planting a much wider range of species than they are saying, and how many people are really just doing what it is that they're doing. So, and, you know, I do think so. It was interesting, the Tree Nation website. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that. They have, I don't really know how you would describe it, but they have web pages that people can put up their projects and you can donate. It's sort of like GoFundMe for restoration, right? And so they have, you know, infrastructure set up in their on each of the pages of sort of, you know, who is doing this, where is it happening, but they have a species tab. And so organizations that had projects listed on Tree Nation, you know, sort of by default wound up having a lot more species listed often than those that weren't using that platform. And so some of it might just be that people don't think to report that because they don't think it matters, or they don't think people are interested in it.
Thank you.
Hi. I also have, I'm sorry, well, my hair. I also have another question related to if these organizations have kind of a list of species per country that they can plant, or what are their requirements to select the species that they will be planting?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think it's a pretty free world. I think they can do whatever they want. And they're really kind of accountable to the donors. And so if the donors care, then maybe they put more emphasis on it. And if they don't, then maybe they don't. So, you know, there's no restrictions on planting non-native species. I mean, you know, in the US, we plant invasive species all the time, you know, in our cities. And certainly in, you know, many of these countries in the tropics, the regulations are even less strong around that. But I think that that would be an opportunity to come up with some lists of suitable species based on a region, and have that kind of more readily available so that NGOs can at least be aware of their options, because I don't think that exists.
And I think it's not only in the US. I mean, many countries in the tropics or subtropics plant a lot of non-native species like pine, eucalyptus, especially for commercial purposes. So also what really caught my attention was not to see, for example, eucalyptus or pine in the list that you show in the presentation.
Yeah, and some of that is, they were there. With eucalyptus and pine were both, when we looked at it on a genus level, were both quite common, but there's just more of a range of eucalyptus species that are planted in pine species, whereas, with coffee, it's just, with cacao, it's just the Abroma cacao. So that's sort of how that played out a little bit there in terms of the frequency. I was going to say something, but now I forgot it. Sorry, give me a second, or someone else can ask another question if they. I was going to. I think just that. I think there are, there have been cases where, there was an interesting. One of my advisors did a study where they used pine plantations as a restoration technique, where they were dealing with invasive Coquila fern that was just making this thick mat and nothing could establish, and so they planted pine there to kind of kickstart a sort of old field successional process. And so I think that there are definitely, it's not. There could be strategies that include using plantations and different things, and I think that maintaining a mosaic of different land uses and different types, some things maybe for economic purposes, some things maybe for more habitat purposes, are a really viable strategy. I think agroforestry and timber plantations can definitely have a role in that. So I'm not trying to say that all of this is inherently damaging by any means, just that it's good to be more aware of what's happening and the scale at which it's happening, so that we can be thoughtful about what we actually want our outcomes to be.
Meredith, have you done any sort of analysis on, like, I guess you mentioned agroforestry, but there's different types of like forest efforts, agroforestry being one of them, like by location?
We did look at whether there were differences in the portions of method used between organizations that were headquartered in the global north and those headquartered in the global south. And we did see there weren't enormous differences. We did see that there was a slight increase in use of agroforestry in the global north, that these big organizations love agroforestry, and there was more greater increase in timber related things in organizations in the global south, which I think is interesting, and to me I think has to do with a little bit that the sort of conservation environmental minded donors in the global north I think of timber as being very extractive and destructive, and so I think that we're more likely to think of agroforestry as being somehow more sustainable, even if timber trees might actually be sequestering a lot more carbon than like tiny cacao shrub, coffee shrubs. So I suspect that has to do with sort of the donor kind of cultural differences, and so that was kind of one of the differences. But
that's interesting. Good. What are your, just to follow up on that, is my last question. But what are your next steps with this research? Or have you tied a bow on it? That's
a great question. This paper just came out, and my postdoc obviously ended since I'm here now. But I really enjoyed this project, and it definitely sparked a lot of interest in me in pursuing more restoration work. So I have been talking a bit with some folks at Conservation International about they are really interested in this work and trying to make sure that their projects are done well, and trying to make sure that monitoring is really integrated from the start. And so I'm hoping that will be a fruitful collaboration going forward, but the details are very, very fuzzy. So yeah. But
any other questions
it looked like Stephanie was there with cookies, so happy to also answer more.
And we also have pizza too.
Oh my God.
So if there's no other like burning questions, then we can, does that sound good? If you guys want to meet down, and it's under the tents and Jordan, in between, or I guess the patio right outside of Old Jordan. Does that
Old
sound-
Jordan?
Yeah, Old Jordan and New Jordan. Have you heard him say that?
No.
I'm in New Jordan right now.
Okay.
Oh, maybe it won't be Old Jordan anymore since they're renovating it. Now, so now that will be confusing.
Coffee Jordan and non-coffee Jordan.
Yeah, there we go. There you go. So the one with the patio out front, and now there's tents. So I guess we'll meet there. And if there's any other questions that you want to ask Meredith, then I'm sure she'll be willing to answer. So other than that, meeting adjourned and for food. Thanks, Meredith. Thanks.